December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. The morning sun cast long shadows across the oil-slicked waters of Pearl Harbor as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the flagship Nagato, thousands of miles away in Japanese waters. The radio crackled with reports of success, American battleships burning, aircraft destroyed on the ground, the Pacific Fleet crippled in a single devastating blow. Yet as his staff officers celebrated around him, Yamamoto's weathered face remained somber. Understood what his colleagues did not. They had awakened a sleeping giant, and in the depths of the Pacific, that giant's most lethal weapon lay waiting. Not the mighty battleships now burning in Hawaiian waters, but the silent, unassuming submarines that most Japanese naval officers dismissed as toys. In the euphoria of Pearl Harbor's success, Japanese naval commanders gathered in war rooms across the empire, their charts spread wide with ambitious plans for conquest. The American submarine force, they laughed, was a negligible threat. Outdated boats manned by sailors who preferred the comfort of surface ships. These underwater vessels, they reasoned, were relics of the Great War, poorly designed and even more poorly commanded. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built their strategy around the decisive surface engagement, the climactic battle where battleships and carriers would settle the fate of the Pacific. Submarines were merely scouts, reconnaissance tools at best. How wrong they would prove to be! The Japanese merchant marine in December 1941 represented the lifeblood of an island empire stretched thin across the Pacific. Over 6 million tons of shipping carried everything from Malayan rubber to Dutch East Indies oil, from Manchurian steel to Korean rice. These merchant vessels, their holds heavy with the resources that fed Japan's war machine, followed predictable routes through familiar waters, often sailing alone and unescorted. Japanese naval doctrine, focused on offensive operations and decisive battles, allocated minimal resources to convoy protection. The Maru, as these merchant ships were known, sailed with confidence born of assumed American weakness and their navy's early victories. January 24, 1943. Off the coast of Wewak, New Guinea. Lieutenant Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton stood on the bridge of USS Wahoo as she slipped beneath the Pacific's surface. The submarine's diesel engines fell silent, replaced by the quiet hum of electric motors as she descended into the blue-black depths. Morton, a Kentuckian with steel-gray eyes and an aggressive spirit that matched his nickname, had already begun transforming American submarine warfare from cautious reconnaissance to ruthless commerce raiding. In his hands, the submarine would become America's most effective weapon against Japanese shipping, a silent predator that would strangle the empire's supply lines with methodical precision. The early months of the Pacific War had indeed seemed to validate Japanese confidence in their assessment of American submarine capabilities. From December 1941 through the summer of 1942, U.S. submarines achieved disappointing results despite numerous contacts with Japanese shipping. The Mark XIV torpedo, the Navy's primary submarine weapon, suffered from catastrophic defects that would take nearly 2 years to fully resolve. Torpedoes ran too deep, their magnetic exploders triggered prematurely, and their contact exploders often failed to detonate. American submarine commanders, trained in peacetime caution and burdened by faulty intelligence, often attacked from excessive distances and relied on single torpedo shots against heavily laden targets. Japanese merchant captains began to report encounters with American submarines with bemused confidence. The Americans, they radioed back to headquarters, were timid and ineffective. Their torpedoes missed more often than they hit, and when they did connect, many failed to explode. These early encounters reinforced the Imperial Navy's dismissive attitude toward the submarine threat. Why divert precious destroyers and aircraft to convoy escort when the American underwater force seemed so incompetent. The reality beneath the waves told a different story. American submarine crews, frustrated by their weapons failures and their commanders' conservative tactics, began to adapt and improvise. Chief Petty Officer James "Red" Ramage, aboard USS Trout, discovered that the Mark XIV 13th torpedo ran 11 feet deeper than set, leading him to manually adjust every shot. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey on USS Barb began conducting surface attacks at night, using his submarine's deck gun when torpedoes proved unreliable. These innovations, born of necessity and desperation, would eventually transform the American submarine force into the most effective commerce raiders in naval history. The symbolic power of the American submarine lay not in its sophisticated technology, which was often faulty, but in the abundance of resources America could bring to bear. While Japan struggled to replace losses with hastily built cargo vessels, American shipyards launched submarines at an unprecedented pace. The industrial might that could produce a Liberty ship in 4 days could also manufacture submarines faster than Japan could sink them. Each American submarine represented not just a weapon, but a manifestation of the democratic arsenal's capacity to overwhelm enemies through sheer productive power. March 19, 1943. Wewak Harbor, New Guinea. The morning mist hung low over Wewak Harbor as Morton peered through Wahoo's periscope at a sight that would have made any submarine commander's heart race. A convoy of 4 Japanese merchant ships anchored in the shallow harbor, their holds bulging with supplies for the beleaguered garrison. The destroyer Harusame patrolled the harbor mouth with lazy confidence, her crew unprepared for the audacity of what was about to unfold. Morton had brought his submarine into the harbor itself, violating every rule of submarine warfare in pursuit of targets the Japanese commanders assumed were safely beyond American reach. What the Japanese garrison at Wewak could not have anticipated was the transformation occurring within the American submarine force. The cautious, conservative doctrine of the pre-war Navy was giving way to aggressive tactics born of combat experience and technological improvement. The Mark XIV torpedo was finally being modified to run at proper depth, and submarine commanders were learning to close to point-blank range where even faulty weapons could achieve devastating results. Men like Morton, Fluckey, and Samuel Dealey were rewriting the rules of submarine warfare, turning their boats into instruments of economic strangulation. The Japanese defenders expected American submarines to behave like the timid attackers of 1942, firing from maximum range, missing their targets, and disappearing at the first sign of resistance. Instead, Morton brought Wahoo to within 800 yards of his targets and began a systematic destruction of the convoy that would become legendary in submarine warfare annals. The first torpedo struck the transport Fukwai Maru amidships, breaking her back and sending her to the bottom within minutes. The second found the tanker Harusame Maru, transforming her cargo of aviation fuel into a pillar of flame that rose hundreds of feet into the tropical sky. The Japanese soldiers on shore watched in stunned disbelief as their supply ships burned and sank in waters they had considered absolutely secure. The psychological impact of the attack far exceeded its material damage. If American submarines could penetrate Wewak Harbor with impunity, no anchorage in the Pacific was safe. The Empire's merchant marine, already stretched thin by rapid territorial expansion, now faced the prospect of losses in their most protected harbors. The harbor attack at Wewak represented a turning point in submarine warfare, the moment when American aggression began to replace Japanese confidence, the sound of depth. Charges detonating beneath the Pacific's surface became the funeral dirge of the Japanese merchant marine. Throughout 1943, as American submarine commanders shed their peacetime inhibitions and embraced total warfare, The distinctive crack of high explosives echoed through the Empire's shipping lanes with increasing frequency. These underwater explosions, initially rare and often ineffective, grew in intensity and accuracy as American crews gained experience and their weapons improved. Each depth charge represented a Japanese merchant ship sent to the bottom, along with its irreplaceable cargo of oil, steel, food, and rubber. Japanese naval intelligence began to compile increasingly desperate reports of shipping losses as 1943 progressed. The statistics told a story of systematic strangulation. 200 von Weidhenenth. Merchant vessels totaling over 1 million tons sunk by American submarines in 1943 alone. The number represented more than just ships. It was oil that would never reach Japanese refineries, rubber that would never become aircraft tires, and food that would never feed Japanese civilians. The Empire's carefully planned logistics network, designed around predictable shipping schedules and secure sea lanes, began to collapse under the weight of submarine-inflicted losses. The transformation of American submarine tactics from cautious scouting to aggressive commerce raiding reflected broader changes in American strategic thinking. The pre-war submarine doctrine, influenced by international law and gentlemanly notions of naval warfare, gave way to total war thinking that prioritized economic target destruction over military protocol. American submarine commanders received explicit orders to sink any vessel flying the Japanese flag, regardless of cargo or destination. This unrestricted submarine warfare, eerily reminiscent of German U-boat tactics in the Atlantic, represented America's commitment to achieving victory through economic strangulation. October 10, 1943. Luzon Strait, Philippines. Commander Richard O'Kane crouched in the conning tower of USS Tang as she stalked a Japanese convoy through the moonless night. The phosphorescent wake of the enemy ships glowed faintly in the darkness, betraying their position to the American submarines' trained lookouts. This convoy, designated by Japanese naval intelligence as absolutely critical to the defense of the Philippines, carried aviation gasoline, ammunition, and replacement aircraft engines that were desperately needed by Japanese air units facing increasing American pressure. O'Kane, a protege of Morton who had absorbed his mentor's aggressive tactics, prepared to demonstrate just how vulnerable Japanese shipping had become to submarine attack. The Japanese convoy commodore, Captain Yamada Hiroshi, commanded his ships with the confidence born of successful voyages and minimal losses. His 4 cargo vessels, escorted by 2 destroyers, followed a route that had been used safely dozens of times before. Yamada's intelligence briefings indicated that American submarine activity in the Luzon Strait was minimal, and his destroyers carried the latest sonar equipment for detecting underwater threats. What Yamada could not have known was that American submarines had evolved far beyond the clumsy, ineffective boats his Navy had encountered in 1942. Tang represented the apex of submarine development, fast, quiet, and armed with finally reliable torpedoes, guided by the most experienced submarine crew in the Pacific. The attack began at 0200 hours, with a spread of 4 torpedoes fired from Tang's forward tubes. O'Kane had closed to 200 yards, point-blank range by submarine standards, ensuring that even the most evasive maneuvers could not save his targets. The first torpedo struck the lead cargo vessel Tatsutamaru directly beneath her bridge, breaking her keel and sending her cargo of aviation gasoline into the sea in a burning slick that illuminated the night for miles. The second found the ammunition ship Shinano Maru, creating an explosion so powerful that debris rained down on Tang's deck 4 miles away. The surviving Japanese ships scattered in panic, their radio operators broadcasting frantic distress calls that revealed the location and composition of every remaining convoy in the Western Pacific. American intelligence stations, monitoring Japanese naval communications, plotted these transmissions on their charts and vectored additional submarines toward the fleeing vessels. What had begun as a single submarine attack evolved into a coordinated pack hunt that would destroy the remainder of the convoy before dawn. The Japanese Navy's communication protocols, designed for coordination between friendly units, had become a liability in the face of American intelligence superiority. Captain Yamada's final radio transmission, intercepted by U.S. Navy cryptographers and preserved in war archives, revealed the profound psychological impact of submarine warfare on Japanese merchant marine officers. American submarines everywhere. Cannot evade. Request immediate air support all sectors. Empire supply line breaking. These words, transmitted in the final moments before his flagship disappeared beneath the waves, captured the growing desperation of Japanese naval commanders who found themselves unable to protect their most vital shipping routes. The economic implications of submarine warfare extended far beyond the ships themselves. Each Japanese merchant vessel represented an investment of steel, labor, and time that the empire could ill afford to lose. The Tatsuta Maru, sunk in Okane's attack, had taken 18 months to build and carried cargo worth more than the ship itself. Her loss meant that Japanese aircraft would fly with reduced fuel loads. Japanese factories would operate with diminished raw materials, and Japanese civilians would face increasingly severe rationing. The 13th submarine had become an instrument of economic warfare more devastating than any surface engagement. Americans' submarine crews began to understand that they were fighting a different kind of war than their surface Navy counterparts. While carriers and battleships sought decisive tactical victories, submarines waged a campaign of economic attrition that slowly strangled Japan's ability to continue fighting. Each torpedo represented not just an explosion, but a reduction in Japan's capacity to wage war. The psychological effect on American submarine crews was profound. They saw themselves as the cutting edge of America's industrial superiority, wielding weapons produced by the most productive economy in human history against an enemy increasingly unable to replace his losses. December 1943, the inland sea of Japan, the sacred waters of the inland sea, considered inviolate by Japanese naval tradition, felt the intrusion of American submarines for the first time as USS Sculpin penetrated the Empire's innermost shipping lanes. Commander Fred Conaway, navigating through minefields and patrol craft that had never before encountered enemy submarines, brought his boat to within sight of the Japanese mainland before launching attacks against coastal shipping. The psychological impact of American submarines operating in Japan's home waters far exceeded the material damage inflicted. The Empire's citizens could no longer assume that any water sphere, safe from enemy attack. Japanese coastal defense forces, designed to repel invasion fleets rather than hunt submarines, proved inadequate to the task of protecting merchant shipping in home waters. Anti-submarine warfare required specialized equipment, trained crews, and coordination between air and sea units that Japan had never developed. The Imperial Navy's focus on offensive operations had left them poorly prepared for defensive warfare, and American submarines exploited this weakness with devastating effectiveness. Coastal shipping, previously immune from attack, became as vulnerable as trans-Pacific convoys. The presence of American submarines in Japanese home waters forced a fundamental reassessment of the Empire's defensive priorities. Naval units previously allocated to offensive operations found themselves recalled to escort duty and anti-submarine patrols. The economic resources required to protect shipping, destroyers, aircraft, fuel, and trained crews represented a massive diversion from Japan's offensive capabilities. Every destroyer assigned to convoy escort was one less available for fleet operations. Every aircraft hunting submarines was one less defending against American bombing raids. The transformation of the Pacific War from a conflict between battle fleets to a struggle for economic survival became apparent in the statistics compiled by both sides throughout. 1943, American submarines, representing less than 2% of U.S. naval personnel, accounted for over 60% of Japanese merchant shipping losses. This extraordinary effectiveness ratio demonstrated the leverage that submarine warfare provided. A relatively small investment in underwater craft yielded disproportionate strategic returns. The submarines had become America's most cost-effective weapon against Japanese economic capacity. Japanese industrial planners, confronted with shipping losses that exceeded replacement capacity, began implementing increasingly desperate measures to maintain supply lines. Merchant vessels received priority for scarce steel allotments, but shipyard capacity remained insufficient to replace losses at the rate American submarines inflicted them. The Empire's shipbuilding industry, designed for peacetime replacement rates and modest wartime expansion, could not adapt quickly enough to submarine warfare's devastating effectiveness. Each month saw Japan's merchant fleet shrink despite maximum construction efforts. January 1944. Tokyo Bay, Emperor Hirohito stood before the windows of his palace study, gazing across Tokyo Bay toward the industrial smokestacks of Yokohama. The morning mist could not conceal the absence that had become increasingly apparent over recent months. The bay, once crowded with merchant vessels loading and unloading cargo, now showed vast expanses of empty water. The emperor's naval advisors had briefed him on shipping losses, but seeing the empty anchorages provided a visual confirmation of the submarine war's devastating impact. The Empire's economic lifeline was slowly being severed by an enemy that most Japanese naval officers had dismissed as incompetent. Just 2 years earlier, the statistical reality of submarine warfare had become undeniable. By early 1944, American submarines had sunk over 1,400 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling more than 5 million tons since Pearl Harbor. The Japanese merchant marine, which had numbered over 6 million tons in December 1941, had been reduced to fewer than 3 million tons of operational shipping. This represented more than a statistical loss. It was the collapse of an Iceland empire's ability to supply itself with the resources necessary for modern warfare. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies fell to a trickle. Rubber shipments from Malaya ceased entirely, and food imports from conquered territories could no longer feed Japan's urban population. The human cost of submarine warfare extended beyond the merchant sailors who died when their ships were torpedoed. Japanese civilians faced increasingly severe rationing as imports dried up. Factory workers struggled with shortages of raw materials, and military units received reduced supplies of everything from fuel to ammunition. The submarine had become an instrument of total warfare, targeting not just military objectives, but the entire economic foundation of enemy society. American submarine commanders understood that every merchant ship they sank brought Japan closer to economic collapse and military defeat. The symbolic power of the submarine lay in its representation of American technological and industrial superiority. Each submarine torpedo was manufactured in factories that produced ammunition faster than Japan could use it, launched from submarines built in shipyards that Japan could not match, and guided by electronic equipment that represented the cutting edge of American innovation. The submarine embodied America's ability to project power across vast distances through superior technology and unlimited resources. Japanese naval officers, who had once mocked American submarine capabilities, now found themselves unable to counter weapon systems that represented the full force of American industrial might. Japanese attempts to counter submarine warfare revealed the Empire's technological and resource limitations. Anti-submarine warfare required sophisticated sonar equipment, trained operators, and coordinated tactics between surface ships and aircraft. Japan possessed few of these capabilities and lacked the industrial capacity to develop them quickly. The Empire's research and development resources stretched thin across multiple military programs, could not match American advances in submarine technology. Each improvement in American submarine capabilities widened the gap between hunter and prey. March 1944, the Philippine Sea. Commander Sam Dealey guided USS Harder through the contested waters of the Philippine Sea, his submarine loaded with the latest Mark 68 electric torpedoes that left no telltale wake to betray their approach. The Japanese convoy ahead, consisting of 6 merchant vessels and 4 escort destroyers, represented one of the last large cargo shipments attempting to reach the Philippines before the anticipated American invasion. Dealey, known throughout the submarine force for his aggressive tactics and innovative approaches to convoy attack, prepared to demonstrate the evolution of American submarine warfare from individual boat operations to coordinated pack hunting. The Japanese convoy commodore, Admiral Takeshi Yamamoto, commanded his ships with the desperate efficiency of an officer who understood that failure to deliver his cargo would leave Japanese defenders in the Philippines without adequate supplies. His intelligence briefings warned of increased American submarine activity, but Yamamoto's escort force represented the most powerful anti-submarine screen the Imperial Navy could provide. 4 destroyers equipped with the latest sonar systems and depth-charge projectors surrounded the merchant vessels in a formation designed to detect and destroy any submarine attempting to approach the convoy. What Admiral Yamamoto could not have anticipated was the coordination between multiple American submarines operating in the same area. Harder was not hunting alone. USS Hake and USS Ray had been vectored to intercept the same convoy, creating a submarine wolf pack that could attack from multiple directions simultaneously. This coordinated approach, refined through months of experience and communication improvements, allowed American submarines to overwhelm even heavily escorted convoys. The Japanese escort screen, designed to counter individual submarine attacks, proved inadequate against multiple boats attacking in coordination. The attack began at dawn, with Harder firing a spread of 6 torpedoes at the convoy's leading merchant vessel. Before the Japanese escorts could react, Heike attacked from the convoy's port quarter, while Ray closed from astern. The coordinated assault created chaos within the Japanese formation as escort destroyers found themselves engaged with submarines on multiple bearings simultaneously. The merchant ships, caught in crossfire between submarines and their own escorts, scattered in panic as their protective screen disintegrated under the pressure of multiple attacks. The battle lasted 6 hours and resulted in the complete destruction of the Japanese convoy. All 6 merchant vessels went to the bottom, along with 2 of the escort destroyers, their cargoes of ammunition, fuel, and food lost forever. The remaining Japanese destroyers, low in fuel and depth charges, could only transmit a final radio report before retreating toward the nearest friendly port. This engagement demonstrated the evolution of American submarine warfare from individual boat hunting to coordinated pack operations that could overwhelm any Japanese defensive measure. Admiral Yamamoto's final message, Hordis Taransatis, intercepted by American intelligence services, revealed the profound impact of submarine warfare on Japanese naval morale. American submarine coordination exceeds all previous experience. Convoy destroyed despite maximum escort. Request revision of all shipping schedules and routes. Current defensive measures inadequate. These words, transmitted moments before his flagship disappeared beneath the waves, captured the Japanese Navy's growing realization that they faced an enemy whose submarine capabilities had evolved far beyond their ability to counter. The economic consequences of convoy destruction extended throughout the Japanese war economy. Each merchant ship represented not just its cargo, but the industrial capacity to produce that cargo and the transportation network to deliver it. The loss of 6 cargo vessels in a single engagement represented months of industrial production, thousands of tons of irreplaceable raw materials, and transportation capacity that could never be recovered. The submarine had become an instrument of economic warfare more devastating than strategic bombing. June 1944. The Mariana Islands. The invasion of Saipan marked a turning point in both the Pacific War and the submarine campaign against Japanese shipping. American submarines, operating from advanced bases in the Marshall Islands, could now maintain continuous patrols throughout the empire's remaining supply routes. The geographic advantage provided by captured bases allowed American submarines to spend more time on patrol and less time in transit, multiplying their effectiveness against Japanese merchant shipping. The strategic initiative had shifted decisively to America, and submarines played a crucial role in maintaining that advantage. Japanese naval planners, confronted with the loss of the Mariana Islands, attempted to organize their shipping routes to avoid American submarine concentrations. These efforts proved futile as American intelligence services, having broken Japanese naval codes, could predict convoy routes and vector submarines to intercept them. The combination of superior intelligence, advanced bases, and improved submarine technology created a situation where Japanese merchant shipping faced almost certain destruction regardless of routing or escort strength. The human drama of submarine warfare played out in countless individual encounters throughout the vast Pacific. Japanese merchant sailors, once confident in their navy's protective capabilities, now sailed with the knowledge that death could come from beneath the waves at any moment. American submarine crews, initially hesitant to embrace unrestricted warfare against merchant shipping, had evolved into efficient killers who understood that every enemy ship they sank shortened the war and saved American lives. The morale complexities of targeting merchant vessels had given way to the practical necessities of Total Warfare. August 1944. The East China Sea Commander Eugene Fluckey stood in the conning tower of USS Barb as she approached the Chinese coast under cover of darkness. His target was not a convoy at sea, but the railroad bridge at Karafuto that carried supplies from Manchuria to Japanese ports. Fluckey had evolved submarine warfare beyond ship-to-ship combat to include attacks on shore installations that supported the enemy's logistical network. This innovation represented the final transformation of American submarine doctrine from conservative naval tradition to aggressive total warfare that recognized no boundaries between military and economic targets. The attack on shore installations by submarine represented a tactical evolution driven by the near-complete destruction of Japanese merchant shipping. With fewer targets available at sea, American submarine commanders sought new ways to disrupt Japan's war economy. Railroad bridges, power plants, coastal factories, and port facilities all became legitimate targets for submarine attack. The submarine had evolved from a purely naval weapon to an instrument of strategic warfare capable of attacking the entire infrastructure that supported enemy military operations. Japanese coastal defenses, designed to repel amphibious invasions rather than submarine raids, proved inadequate to protect shore installations from underwater attack. The speed and stealth of submarine operations allowed American boats to approach undetected, deliver their attacks, and disappear before defensive forces could respond effectively. This tactical advantage represented a fundamental shift in the nature of naval warfare. Submarines could now project power ashore with minimal risk to themselves, while imposing maximum damage on enemy economic targets. The psychological impact of submarine attacks on Japanese home waters far exceeded their material damage. The knowledge that American submarines could strike at will against targets previously considered invulnerable created a sense of helplessness that permeated Japanese society. If submarines could destroy railroad bridges and factories on the home islands, no target was safe from American attack. The submarine had become a symbol of American reach and Japanese vulnerability. October 1944. Leyte Gulf. The Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the effective end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force, But submarines continued their relentless campaign against the remaining fragments of Japan's merchant marine. USS Tang, under the command of Richard O'Kane, operated in the shallow waters between Formosa and the Chinese coast, hunting the small coastal vessels that represented Japan's last remaining shipping capability. These final operations demonstrated the complete transformation of the submarine war from attacks against major convoys to the systematic destruction of Japan's residual transportation capacity. The Japanese merchant marine in late 1944 bore little resemblance to the confident fleet that had carried the Empire's supplies across the Pacific 3 years earlier. Reduced to a handful of small coastal vessels operating under cover of darkness, Japan's remaining shipping capability could barely maintain minimal supply lines between the home islands and the Asian mainland. The great merchant ships that had once carried oil from the Dutch East Indies and rubber from Malaya were gone, replaced by fishing boats and coastal steamers pressed into service as cargo carriers. American submarine commanders, having achieved complete supremacy over Japanese shipping, now hunted individual vessels with the same methodical precision they had once applied to large convoys. The techniques developed for attacking major merchant ships proved equally effective against smaller targets, and the psychological pressure on Japanese crews remained constant regardless of ship size. The submarine had become an omnipresent threat that made any movement by sea a potentially fatal gamble for Japanese forces. The statistical record of submarine warfare in the Pacific revealed the complete effectiveness of America's underwater campaign. By late 1944, American submarines had sunk over 1,300 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling more than 5.3 million tons, representing over 80% of Japan's pre-war merchant fleet. This level of destruction exceeded even the most optimistic American pre-war projections and demonstrated the strategic leverage that submarine warfare could provide when conducted with adequate resources and aggressive tactics. December 1944, the inland sea, USS Redfish, penetrated the sacred waters of Japan's inland sea for the final major submarine operation of the Pacific War. Commander Louis Shane navigated through heavily mined waters to attack the aircraft carrier Unryu, one of Japan's last remaining major warships. The symbolic importance of American submarine operations in Japan's home waters exceeded their tactical significance. The ability to strike at targets within sight of the Japanese mainland demonstrated the complete collapse of the Empire's defensive perimeter. The submarine had become an instrument of strategic humiliation as well as tactical destruction. The sinking of Unryu represented more than the loss of a single warship. It symbolized the complete failure of Japan's naval strategy and the vindication of American submarine warfare doctrine. The carrier, built at enormous cost in scarce materials and skilled labor, lasted less than 6 months before falling victim to American submarine attack. The disparity between Japanese construction time and American destruction capability illustrated the fundamental imbalance that submarine warfare had created in the Pacific conflict. Japanese naval officers, witnessing the destruction of their fleet's remnants by American submarines operating in home waters, began to understand the true strategic impact of the underwater campaign. The submarines had not merely sunk ships, they had severed the economic arteries that connected Japan's island empire to its conquered territories. Without reliable shipping, the empire's far-flung possessions became isolated outposts that consumed resources without contributing to Japan's war effort. The submarine had achieved what no surface fleet could accomplish: the complete economic strangulation of an enemy nation. January 1945, Tokyo, the Imperial Palaces. Morning briefings no longer included. Reports of merchant shipping arrivals there were none to report. Japan's merchant marine, once the third largest in the world, had been reduced to a handful of coastal vessels that moved only at night and never far from shore. The empire's industrial production, starved of raw materials, had fallen to a fraction of wartime peaks. Oil imports, the lifeblood of modern warfare, had ceased entirely. The submarine campaign, dismissed by Japanese naval officers as a minor irritant in 1941, had achieved what no surface fleet or bombing campaign could accomplish: the complete economic isolation of Japan. The human cost of economic strangulation manifested itself. Throughout Japanese society, urban populations faced severe food shortages as rice imports from Korea and Manchuria ceased. Factory workers struggled with inadequate raw materials and frequent power outages. Military units received reduced fuel allocations and ammunition supplies. The submarine had become an instrument of total warfare that targeted not just military objectives but the entire economic foundation of enemy society. Every torpedo that found its mark brought Japan closer to economic collapse and military surrender. American submarine crews, reflecting on their role in Japan's defeat, understood that they had participated in a form of warfare that transcended traditional naval combat. They had not merely sunk ships, they had strangled an empire's economy and demonstrated the strategic leverage that technological superiority could provide. The submarine, once dismissed as a minor auxiliary to the battle fleet, had proven itself the most effective weapon in America's naval arsenal. The 16,000 men who served in American submarines during the Pacific War represented less than 2% of U.S. naval personnel, but accounted for more than half of all Japanese naval and merchant losses. The tee-hee sound of compressed air rushing into ballast. Tanks had become the death knell of Japanese military ambitions. Each time an American submarine surfaced after a successful attack, that distinctive hiss represented another step toward Japan's inevitable defeat. The submarines that Japanese naval officers had mocked as obsolete weapons, manned by incompetent crews, had evolved into the most sophisticated and effective instruments of economic warfare in naval history. The laughing had stopped long ago, replaced by the grim recognition that American submarines had accomplished what their surface fleet never could: the complete destruction of Japan's ability to wage war. August 15, 1945, the Pacific Ocean. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement crackled across radio waves that reached American submarines still on patrol throughout the Pacific. USS Spikefish, cruising submerged off the coast of Honshu, received the message that ended the most successful submarine campaign in naval history. Commander William Germershausen ordered his boat to surface for the last time as a combatant vessel, her crew emerging onto the bridge to see the sun reflecting off waters that American submarines had made their own domain. The Pacific, once the highway of Japanese empire, had become an American lake patrolled by submarines that had proven the decisive weapon of naval warfare. The strategic impact of American submarine warfare extended far beyond the ships destroyed and cargoes sent to the bottom. The submarines had demonstrated that modern warfare could be won through economic strangulation rather than climactic battles between opposing fleets. The patient, methodical destruction of enemy logistics proved more decisive than any surface engagement or bombing campaign. In the vast expanses of the Pacific, where distance was measured in thousands of miles and time in months, the submarine's ability to interdict enemy supply lines proved the key to strategic victory. The transformation of American submarine warfare from cautious scouting to aggressive commerce raiding reflected broader changes in American strategic thinking during World War II. The pre-war notion of warfare as a contest between military forces gave way to total war concepts that recognized the interconnection between military capability and economic capacity. American submarines, originally designed as adjuncts to the battle fleet, became independent strategic weapons, capable of achieving decisive results through persistent application against enemy economic targets. The legacy of the Pacific submarine campaign would influenced naval thinking for generations. The demonstration that relatively small numbers of technologically advanced submarines could achieve strategic results disproportionate to their size and cost transformed naval planning worldwide. The age of the battleship, already challenged by aircraft carrier operations, ended definitively with the proof that submarines could accomplish strategic missions impossible for surface fleets. The underwater domain, once considered auxiliary to surface operations, had proven itself the decisive theater of naval warfare. In the end, Japan's confident laughter at American submarine capabilities in December 1941 had been replaced by the bitter recognition that those same submarines had accomplished what no enemy in Japanese history had achieved: the complete severing of the island empire's connection to the resources that sustained modern warfare. The merchant fleet that had carried the empire's ambitions across the Pacific lay scattered in pieces across the ocean floor, testament to the strategic vision that recognized economic targets as more valuable than military ones. The submarine, symbol of American industrial might and technological innovation, had proven that in the age of total warfare, victory belonged not to the nation with the most powerful navy, but to the one with the most effective means of destroying the enemy's capacity to continue fighting. The Pacific Ocean, once alive with the sounds of Japanese commerce and conquest, now carried only the memories of an empire that had laughed at American submarines until they sank half their merchant fleet, and with it, any hope of victory in the war they had so confidently begun.